I had learned, over 22 years of dying slowly, that the body keeps its own ledger of betrayals. Mine had been counting since birth. That morning the count included 3 flights of stairs I had not climbed, a heartbeat that skipped and stumbled if I laughed too hard, and the particular gray light of an autumn dawn filtering through paper screens that meant I had survived another night. I lay still for a long moment before moving, the way Fu had taught me, testing each breath before I trusted it with my full weight. "You're awake," Fu said from the doorway, already reading my face the way she always did, cataloging color and breath and the tremor in my hands before I'd said a word. "Good color today. High praise," I said. "Tell the physician I might live to see winter." She didn't laugh. She rarely did anymore, not since my father's men had started disappearing from the household one by one, sold off or dismissed as our fortunes collapsed. I understood, dimly, that something in the house had shifted these past weeks. Hushed conversations behind doors, my father's face gone the color of old parchment, my mother weeping in a way she thought I couldn't hear through the walls. I had assumed it was only money. Our house had been bleeding money since before I was born, since the scandal that stripped my grandfather's rank and left us clinging to a dukedom that was a title in name only, a debt with a crest stamped on it. I had made my peace with being the family's shame long ago, the sickly son locked away in the East Wing, brought out for the rare ceremony and hidden again before I could embarrass anyone by collapsing at it. I did not yet know that shame had a floor, and that we had found it. My father summoned me at midday, which alone should have told me something was wrong. He never summoned me. He visited, on the rare occasions guilt overcame convenience, sitting stiffly at my bedside for exactly as long as courtesy required before excusing himself to somewhere I wasn't. To be called to him, to walk the length of the house on legs that ached by the time I reached his study, that was new, and new was rarely good, not in a house like mine. He did not look at me when I entered. That too told me something. "Sit," he said, "before you fall." I sat. The chair was cold beneath me, and my heart was already doing its nervous stutter step, the one it performed whenever I exerted myself or feared something, and I could no longer tell which this was. "There has been a development," my father said, to the middle distance, to a point on the wall just past my shoulder. "Regarding the matter of the grain contracts." I knew about the grain contracts the way I knew about most things in that house, through walls, through servants, through the careful architecture of what people thought I was too weak to need to understand. My father had falsified shipping manifests to the imperial garrison in the north, skimming grain meant for soldiers and selling it to line-starved merchants at triple price while men on the border ate less. It was, by any definition anyone in the empire recognized, treason. "They know," I said. "They know." His jaw worked. "The emperor's men arrived this morning with the full accounting. Every falsified seal. Every merchant's name." He finally looked at me, and what was in his face wasn't fear exactly. It was closer to calculation, the particular coldness of a man doing arithmetic with his children as the variables. "The sentence for what I did is execution. Mine, and by law, every man of my bloodline old enough to inherit." My mouth had gone dry. Then the emperor has offered an alternative. He said it fast, like tearing a bandage. "A marriage. He requires a consort of noble blood who poses no political threat, no family strength, no faction, no army waiting behind him to make demands. In exchange for the alliance, House Wei's treason is absorbed, forgiven in the manner these things are forgiven. My life, your brother's, the house's name, such as it still is." Something in me went very still and very quiet, the way it always did right before the worst was said aloud, as though my body already understood what my mind was still catching up to. "Who?" I said, though I already knew. There was only one person in the empire whose marriage could purchase a life, whose name made grown men in the capital lower their voices. The Dragon Emperor, Xie Heng, whose court gossip whispered of 3 dead consorts and no clear cause of death for any of them, whose temper was said to be cold enough to freeze blood in the vein. "His Imperial Majesty," my father said, "has requested you specifically. A sickly Omega son, unlikely to survive the year regardless." He was quite direct about his reasoning in the letter. A muscle jumped in his cheek. It solves his succession question without obligating him to it. And it solves ours. I sat in that cold chair in my father's study and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in the worst moments of a life, that I had just been sold, not despite my dying, but because of it. My weakness was not the thing that had spared me. It was the thing that had made me useful. "When do I leave?" I asked, and my voice did not shake, though everything beneath my ribs was screaming. 3 days, my father said, and finally looked away. "The wedding is to be held at the Winter Palace. Before the first snow." Outside, I could already smell it coming, that particular metal sharpness in the air that meant the cold was close. I had 3 days left in the only home I'd ever known, and then I would be given, like a debt repaid, into the hands of a man they called a monster. I did not yet know that I would spend the rest of my life grateful for it. The Winter Palace did not look like a place that housed a monster. That was, I would come to learn, precisely the point. I had expected black stone and iron spikes, something that announced its cruelty from a distance the way our crumbling estate announced its poverty. Instead, the palanquin carried me through gates of pale gray stone veined with something that caught the light like frost trapped under glass, past gardens where the last chrysanthemums of the season still held their color despite the cold, past fountains that ran clear and unfrozen though the air itself had teeth. Beautiful, precise, utterly without warmth, for all its careful loveliness. A place built by someone who understood exactly how to make ice look like elegance. A foo had been permitted to come with me, my one mercy in all of this, and she gripped my hand hard enough to hurt as the palanquin set down before the ceremonial hall. "Breathe," she murmured. For my benefit or her own, I couldn't say. I breathed. Cost me more than it should have. The wedding itself passed in the strange underwater way that important, terrible things often do. I remember red silk heavy on my shoulders, the weight of it worse than any fever I'd survived. I remember incense thick enough to catch in my damaged lungs and the effort it took not to cough through my own vows. I remember bowing before an altar to the frost ancestors and feeling my knees threaten to fail me on the way back up, and a hand, not mine, not a foo's, closing around my elbow at exactly the moment I needed it, steadying me before I fell. I looked up into gold eyes the color of banked fire, and understood I had just met my husband. He did not smile. He did not speak, not then, not through the entire remainder of the ceremony, only released my arm the instant I no longer needed it, with a precision that felt less like courtesy and more like a man carefully returning a borrowed object to exactly the position he'd found it in. He was taller than I'd imagined from rumor, black-haired, dressed in unornamented black against the ceremonial red and gold of everyone around him, as though he'd made a decision long ago to stand out from his own court by refusing all its color. The Dragon Emperor. My husband. A man rumored to have buried 3 consorts and never once explained why. He looked up close less like a monster and more like a man standing very carefully still, the way I stood when I was rationing my strength, when one wrong movement might cost me more than I had to spend. I recognized that stillness. I had spent my whole life inside it. We were given, after the ceremony, precisely 1 hour of private audience before the banquet, tradition, I gathered, though nothing about the interaction felt traditional. He received me in a receiving room hung with pale silk, seated with the kind of stillness that made the furniture around him look nervous, and gestured me to the seat across from him with a single motion of his hand. "Duke Wei," he said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man who measured every word before spending it. "You may speak plainly with me. I find I have little patience for court flattery, and I doubt you have the breath to spare for it." It was, I would come to understand, the single kindest thing anyone in that palace would say to me for weeks, an acknowledgement unasked for of the exact shape of my weakness, offered without pity and without cruelty either. Then plainly, I said, "I know why you chose me." Something flickered behind the gold of his eyes. Not quite surprise. Something more careful than that. "Do you? A consort with no army behind him. No faction. No family strength to make demands of the throne." I kept my voice even, though my heart was doing its familiar stutter beneath my ribs. "A consort unlikely to survive the year, which solves your succession question without obligating you to solve it properly." My father was quite forthcoming about the arithmetic. The silence that followed was long enough that I wondered if I'd miscalculated. If plain speech was a courtesy he'd offered and I had somehow abused. But when he finally spoke, his voice had gone lower still, and something in it I couldn't name. "Your father," he said, "is a fool who nearly cost soldiers their lives for coin." I would not put much faith in his understanding of my reasoning. "Then correct me." Another silence. Longer. "No," he said finally. "Not tonight." It was not a refusal exactly, I understood later. It was a door left deliberately, carefully ajar, in a man who I would come to learn did not leave doors ajar for anyone. But that night I only knew that my new husband had looked at me across a table with an intensity that made my damaged heart forget, briefly, how to keep its careful rhythm, and had told me not tonight in a voice that promised there might, someday, be a night when the answer was different. He rose to escort me to the banquet himself, which I understood even then was not required of him. And as he offered his arm, not touching me, only offering, waiting to see if I would take it, I noticed, for the first time, the faint scarring visible at his collarbone where his robe had shifted, pale and old and shaped like nothing I recognized. Burn scars, perhaps, or something else entirely. He caught me looking. For one unguarded moment, something that might have been fear crossed that careful, controlled face. Gone so fast I nearly convinced myself I'd imagined it. "You will find," he said, adjusting his collar with a hand that was not quite steady, "that there is a great deal about me you are better off not asking questions about, Duke Wei." "Wei Lian," I corrected, before I could stop myself. "If I am to be your husband, I would prefer you use my name." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but its distant cousin. A softening at the corner of his mouth that vanished as quickly as it came. "Lian," he said, testing the shape of it like a man handling something fragile. "Then you may call me Heng, when we are alone." It was, I would understand only much later, the first and last time in 3 years that anyone in that palace would hear the Dragon Emperor volunteer such a thing to a stranger, and I had no way yet of knowing what it would cost him to keep offering it. The palace, I learned quickly, ran on rules no one troubled to explain to me. There was the rule that consorts did not walk the Eastern Gallery after dark, though no servant would say why when I asked, only glanced at each other and changed the subject with the particular skill of people trained to survive by not knowing things. There was the rule that I was never, under any circumstance, to enter the emperor's private study uninvited. A rule enforced not by guards but by the servants themselves, who steered me away from that wing with the gentle, immovable firmness of people redirecting a child from a cliff edge. And there was the rule, unspoken but absolute, that no one at court looked directly at the faint white scars visible at the base of my husband's throat, though I caught more than one gaze sliding away from them with practiced speed. "They're afraid of him," Fu said one evening, braiding my hair with the same careful hands she'd used since I was a boy too weak to lift a comb myself. "Afraid, and something else besides. I can't place it yet." "Grief," I said, before I'd fully decided to say it aloud. "It looks like grief." She went still behind me. "You'd know." I would. I had spent my whole life watching people grieve me before I'd finished dying. My mother's careful, preemptive mourning, my father's guilty avoidance, the particular way servants sometimes looked at me like I was already a memory. I recognized the shape of it on the faces of Xie Heng's court, and increasingly on Xie Heng himself. He was, against every rumor that had followed me to this palace, unfailingly careful with me. Not warm, not yet. Warmth would have required a fluency in tenderness he did not seem to possess, or did not trust himself to use. But careful in ways that accumulated faster than I could explain them away as courtesy. A new physician arrived within the week, more skilled than any who had attended me at home, and when I asked who had summoned him, the man only bowed and said His Majesty's household, as though that answered anything. The guard posted outside my apartments changed on the third day, replaced by a quieter, more watchful woman after I had mentioned, only once, only in passing, to A Fu, in a conversation I'd thought entirely private, that the previous guard's habit of staring unsettled me. "How?" I asked Heng directly, the one evening he joined me for tea in the walled garden that had become, without either of us naming it as such, our shared territory. "Did you know I wanted the guard changed?" I told no one but A Fu. He did not look up from the tea he was pouring, though his hands, I noticed, had gone very precise, the way mine did when I was concentrating on not trembling. Walls in this palace carry further than people expect. That isn't an answer. No, he agreed. It isn't. I had learned, in 3 weeks of marriage, that pressing him past a closed door rarely opened it. That Xie Heng retreated behind formality the way I retreated behind wit, both of us building walls out of whatever materials we had on hand. So instead I let it go, and watched him instead, the way I'd always survived, through patience, through observation, through the accumulation of small facts no one thought to hide from a dying man they assumed wasn't paying attention. I noticed that he ate sparingly, and only foods that required no fire in their preparation. I noticed that braziers were kept unlit in any room he occupied for long, even as the season turned properly cold, and that he wore, always, a heavy black robe that seemed less like fashion and more like armor. I noticed that when General Zhou Rui, a broad, blunt man who treated Heng with the easy familiarity of old friendship and treated me with the careful suspicion of a man assessing a liability, raised his voice in irritation during a strategy discussion I'd been permitted to observe, Heng's hand had gone white-knuckled around his teacup, and the temperature in the room had seemed, for one strange moment, to climb. I said nothing of it. I filed it away, the way I filed away everything, in the small ledger I kept of a man I was beginning, against every instinct for self-preservation I possessed, to want to understand. It was a Fu who brought me the warning. For weeks into my marriage, her face bloodless in a way I'd only seen once before, the night my father told me I was being sold. "There's talk in the servants' quarters," she said low, checking the door twice before she spoke. "Minister Bo's faction. They're saying the marriage was a mistake, that a consort with no allies was meant to be no threat, but that His Majesty spends too much time with you. That you're gaining influence you shouldn't have." "I have no influence," I said. "I've barely left these apartments." "That's not the point, and you know it." She gripped my hands, and hers were shaking. "They're saying it would be simpler if you were sick again. Sicker than usual. An unfortunate turn, the kind no one could prove wasn't natural, given your condition." The words settled into my chest like ice through a crack in old stone. I had spent 22 years half expecting my own death by natural causes, my heart finally losing its long argument with my body. I had never once considered that someone might simply help it along, and disguise the help as inevitability. That night, for the first time since my wedding, I found myself walking, slowly, carefully, one careful hand against the wall, toward the wing of the palace I had been told, in every language but words, never to enter. I did not make it to Heng's study. I made it only as far as the Eastern Gallery, forbidden after dark for reasons no one would explain, before I heard voices ahead in the dark. Minister Bo's, low and urgent, and a second voice I didn't recognize discussing, in careful and deliberate language, a shipment of something that needed to arrive at my apartments before the week's end, disguised among the physician's supplies, and understood, with my heart hammering hard enough to hurt, that I had just walked, unguarded, into the middle of my own murder being planned. I did not remember deciding to run. I only remembered the wall against my shoulder, cold stone biting through silk, and the desperate, silent arithmetic of getting myself back down the gallery before either voice turned and found me there. I made it perhaps 10 steps before my body, which had never once in my life cooperated when I needed it most, chose that moment to fail me. My vision narrowed at the edges. My breath came in short, useless pulls that gave no air. I caught myself against a pillar, and the sound of my own labored breathing seemed, in that dark and empty gallery, loud enough to summon every guard in the palace. It summoned something worse. Footsteps, fast, and Minister Bo's voice cutting off mid-sentence. I do not know how long I stood there, willing my traitor heart into silence, before the footsteps retreated instead of advancing, before whatever instinct for self-preservation Bo possessed won out over curiosity, and I was left alone in the dark, shaking, alive by no virtue of my own. A Fu found me an hour later, still sitting against that pillar because I hadn't trusted my legs to carry me further, and did not ask questions until she had me back in my own apartments with tea forced into my hands and color slowly returning to my face. "You heard something," she said. "Not a question." I told her. All of it, Bo's voice, the shipment, the word disguised. I watched her face go through fear and then something harder, more decided. You have to tell him, she said. Tonight. Tell him what? That I broke his one rule and overheard a conversation I can't prove was about me. But even as I said it, I knew she was right, knew that whatever pride or fear had kept me from that forbidden wing for 4 weeks was smaller now than the plain fact of the ledger in my chest. Someone in this palace wanted me dead, and disguised as natural, and I had exactly one person with the power to stop it. I went to him myself. I did not send a servant, did not wait for morning. I walked the length of the palace on legs still unsteady from the gallery, past guards who startled to see me and let me pass anyway, some instinct in them recognizing this as a thing that could not wait for propriety. His study door was, for the first time since my wedding, standing open. He was not seated at his desk. He was standing at the window with his back to the door, and even from the threshold I could feel something wrong in the room, a warmth that had no business existing in a palace built to run cold, radiating off him like heat off a forge. Heng, I said. He did not turn. You should not be here. I know. I came anyway. I stepped further into the room, and the warmth intensified, close to uncomfortable now, close to the fevered heat of my worst nights. I overheard Minister Bo tonight, in the Eastern Gallery. He's planning something, a shipment, disguised as physician supplies, meant for my apartments by week's end. Now he turned, and I saw his face fully for the first time in that unguarded moment. Saw the way his jaw was locked, the way his hands, braced against the windowsill, had left cracks spidering through the stone beneath his fingers. You should not be here, he said again. And this time there was something raw underneath the control, something close to panic. Lian, please, leave the room. Not until you tell me what's happening to you. I am trying, he said, and his voice cracked on the word. To keep you from finding out the hard way. The candles on his desk guttered, all at once, as though a wind had passed through a room with no windows open. I felt the heat climb another degree, felt sweat break out along my hairline despite the season, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes to a person who has spent a lifetime cataloging the failures of bodies, that I was witnessing something no physician's training could explain. The scars, I said slowly, on your throat, they're not old wounds. I didn't have the word. I reached for the nearest true thing instead. They're a leash. Something in his face broke open at that. Grief and fear tangled together so completely I couldn't have separated them if I'd tried. My bloodline carries a curse older than this throne, he said, the words coming fast now, like a dam giving way. Dragon blood, deep enough that strong feeling, grief, fear, want, all of it becomes heat, becomes fire I cannot always control. My grandfather burned down half a wing of this palace mourning his own father. My father killed the concubine he loved most in a single unguarded moment of rage he could not take back. His hands, I saw now, were trembling. I have 3 husbands buried in the Eastern Gardens, Lian, and every physician who examined them recorded a different cause. Fever, failure of the heart, an accident with a brazier. None of them died by my hand directly. All of them died because I let myself feel something for them, and could not stop what came after. The room was very hot now, and very quiet, and I understood that I was standing closer to true danger than Minister Bo's poison had ever posed, and that I felt, God help me, no urge whatsoever to step back. That's why the braziers stay unlit, I said. Why you keep everyone at a careful distance. Why you chose a consort you thought you couldn't come to feel anything for. Yes, the word came out of him like something torn loose. And it was working, Lian. Until it wasn't. I should have been afraid. Every rational instinct I possessed, the same instincts that had kept my failing body alive for 22 years past what any physician expected, should have carried me straight out of that overheated room and back to the relative safety of my own apartments. Instead, I found myself crossing the space between us, close enough to feel the heat radiating off him like a hearth fire, close enough to see the fine tremor in his hands as he fought whatever war was being waged beneath his skin. Lian. My name, in his mouth, sounded like a warning and a plea in equal measure. Get back. I mean it. I don't. His breath caught. I don't trust myself right now. You've had 4 weeks to hurt me, I said. If that's truly what you wanted. Guards you reassigned. Physicians you sent. a hand at my elbow every time I nearly fell. My heart was doing its familiar stutter, though for once I couldn't be entirely certain it was the illness and not simply him. I don't think you're dangerous to me, Heng. I think you're dangerous to yourself, believing that you are. Something in his control fractured further at that. Not the fire, but something quieter, more devastating. His hand came up, hesitated in the air between us like a man reaching toward something he trained himself for years never to touch, and then, achingly slow, brushed against my cheek. His skin was fever-hot. I did not pull away. Every time, he said, so low I nearly lost the words. I have let this get close enough to feel real. Someone I loved has died of it. I cannot. I will not do that to you. Then teach me how to help you carry it, I said, instead of deciding alone that I can't. For one suspended moment, I thought he might actually let me. I saw something loosen in his shoulders, saw the terrible heat in the room begin, infinitesimally, to ease. And then the door behind us slammed open, and General Zhou Rui filled the threshold with his sword already drawn, face white with an urgency that had nothing to do with what he was walking in on. Your Majesty. His eyes cut to me, to the cracked stone beneath the window, to the guttered candles, and something like understanding and horror crossed his face in the same breath. But he didn't slow. Forgive the intrusion. There's been an incident in the consort's apartments. A servant caught tampering with the medicine stores. She's confessed to acting on Minister Bo's orders. His gaze found me again, harder this time. And there's a fire, my lord, in the physician's wing. Started not 10 minutes ago. The heat in the room around us vanished all at once, so completely that I felt the sudden cold like a slap. Heng's whole body had gone rigid, his hand dropping from my face as though I'd burned him instead of the reverse. Get him to safety, Heng said, and his voice had gone back to that glacial court register I'd first met at my wedding. Every trace of the man who'd touched my cheek buried under it like snow over a grave. Now, Zhou Rui. Away from me. Heng. Now. Zhou Rui's hand closed around my arm before I could argue further, pulling me from the room with a strength that brooked no resistance, and I caught one last glimpse of my husband standing alone in his study, hands braced white-knuckled against the windowsill, the air around him beginning, once more, to shimmer with heat. The corridor outside was full of running servants and the acrid smell of smoke. Zhou Rui half-carried me through it, and it wasn't until we'd cleared 2 wings and reached the relative safety of the outer garden that he finally spoke. His voice rough with something between anger and fear. How long? He demanded. Has he been letting you close enough for this? I don't understand. The fire in the physician's wing didn't start from any brazier, Duke Wei. It started from nothing at all, in a room with no open flame, not 10 minutes after you walked into his study. His jaw was tight. I have served him 15 years. I buried the last 3 men he let himself care for. I will not stand by and watch a 4th. The accusation in his voice was almost a relief. Simpler, at least, than the tangled thing in my own chest. The fear and want knotted together so tightly I could no longer separate them. But before I could answer, before I could find any words at all for what I just witnessed, a cry went up from the direction of the physician's wing, sharp and panicked, and through the smoke haze I saw servants dragging someone, clear of the burning building. A Fu's voice, screaming my name. I ran before I'd decided to, ran on legs that had no business running, my heart slamming a warning I ignored completely, and reached the edge of the crowd in time to see them lay the still, soot-blackened figure on the grass. It was not a Fu they'd pulled from the fire. It was the physician Heng had sent for me, the man who had tended me faithfully for 4 weeks, whose hands had eased more of my suffering than any doctor before him, and he was not moving, and the medicine stores he'd been guarding, the ones meant to protect me from exactly the poison Minister Bo had planned, were gone. The physician lived. I would not learn that for certain until nearly dawn, after a Fu had scrubbed the smoke smell from my hands and hair and forced me into a bed I had no intention of sleeping in. But he lived, burned along one arm, lungs full of smoke, but breathing under a healer's careful watch. He had, the servants said, been caught trying to save the medicine stores from whoever had set the fire, rather than fleeing it himself. I lay awake turning that fact over like a stone in my palm. A man had nearly died protecting supplies meant to keep me alive, in a fire that may or may not have started from my husband's own unraveling grief, set, I was increasingly certain, by someone hoping the chaos would let Minister Bo's poison slip through unnoticed after all. Two threats, tangled together in the smoke. I could not tell anymore where one ended and the other began. Heng did not come to me that night or the next. I heard of him only secondhand, that he had confined himself to his study, that Zhou Rui stood guard outside it with an expression the servants described as grim as a funeral, that no braziers had been lit in that wing of the palace in 3 days despite the deepening cold. I understood, without being told, that he was punishing himself in the only language he seemed fluent in, distance. It was Consort Dowager Yin who finally came to me, on the 4th day, uninvited and unannounced, settling into the chair across from my sickbed with the unhurried authority of a woman who had outlived several husbands' worth of court intrigue and answered to no one's schedule but her own. "You look," she said, studying me with sharp, unsentimental eyes, "like a woman deciding whether to fight for something or let it go. I've worn that face myself. I'm not sure I know which one I'm choosing. Then let me help you decide." She folded her hands. "I am the only person left in this palace who was present for all 3 of my nephew's marriages before yours. I watched each of those boys die, Duke Wei, and I watched what it did to him each time, and I will tell you now what none of them ever understood in time to save themselves. Heng does not lose control because he loves too carelessly. He loses control because he has spent his entire life believing love and control cannot coexist in him, and so he never learned how to hold both at once. He runs toward isolation the way you run toward accepting your own death, as though surrender were the safest available choice." The comparison landed harder than she likely intended. "That isn't surrender," I said. "It's arithmetic. I've simply done the sums on my own body honestly, where he refuses to do them on his heart." Something that might have been approval crossed her face. "Then perhaps you're the first consort clever enough to argue with him in a language he actually understands." She rose, smoothing her robes. "The fire that nearly killed your physician did not come from Heng's grief alone, child. Zhou Rui found accelerant in the physician's wing oil, deliberately placed. Someone wanted that fire to look like one of Heng's episodes, to cover a very human crime with a very inhuman excuse. Minister Bo has spent years cultivating exactly that rumor about my nephew for precisely this purpose. A monster makes a convenient scapegoat for a murderer." The pieces I'd been holding separately clicked into place all at once. The monstrous reputation that had followed Heng into every room since before I'd ever met him. Not merely the truth of his curse, but a story someone had been sharpening into a weapon for years, patient enough to wait for the perfect moment to use it. "I have to see him," I said, already pushing myself upright despite Efu's protesting hand on my shoulder. "I rather thought you might." The dowager's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "His study, child. And do try not to die proving your point. I find I've grown rather fond of you in 4 short days, which is more than I can say for the others." I made the walk to his study alone this time, refusing Efu's arm though every step cost me, because I understood, with a clarity that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with something far more dangerous, that whatever I said to him next needed to be mine, unaided, or it would mean nothing at all. Zhou Rui stood outside the door as reported, and did not move to stop me. He only studied my face for a long moment, then stepped aside without a word, which frightened me more than any protest would have, as though even he had run out of ways to keep this from happening. I opened the door without knocking. Heng stood exactly where I'd left him 4 days prior, as if he had not moved, as if he had simply been waiting, hollow-eyed, unslept, the cold in the room now so absolute my breath fogged in front of my face. "I told you to stay away from me," he said, without turning. "You told Zhou Rui to keep me away," I said. "You never once asked whether I wanted to stay." He finally turned to face me, and I saw exactly what 4 days of solitary punishment had cost him. Hollow shadows beneath his eyes, a stillness that no longer looked like discipline but like a man holding himself together through will alone. "I nearly burned down a wing of my own palace," he said. "A man is lying in the healer's ward because of what I am. And you walked in here anyway." "A man is lying in the healer's ward," I said, "because someone deliberately set that fire with oil, and let your reputation take the blame for a very human crime." The dowager told me, Zhou Rui found the evidence himself. Whatever he'd braced for, it wasn't that. I watched the words land, watched some old, exhausted certainty in him crack under the weight of a truth he hadn't let himself consider. That does not change what I am capable of, Lian. The heat was real. My control was real, and it failed. I'm not asking you to be safe, I said, crossing the room despite the cold that bit through my robes, despite every instinct screaming at me to preserve what little strength I had. I've never once been safe, Heng. My whole life has been a slow negotiation with a body that could fail me at any moment, for no reason at all, with no villain to blame. I know exactly what it is to live beside a danger I can't fully control. I am not afraid of standing near yours. You should be. I've decided not to be. That's mine to decide, not yours. I stopped close enough now to feel the last of the cold receding from the air between us, close enough to see his hands unclench at his sides. You've spent your whole life believing love and control are enemies. The Dowager said as much, and I think she's right, and I think you have never once let anyone stay long enough to prove you wrong. His breath left him unsteadily. And if I hurt you anyway? If wanting you costs you the very thing your body can least afford to lose? Then we'll have failed together, I said. Instead of you failing alone in an empty room while I die a slow, tidy death somewhere else entirely, waiting for permission to matter to you. I'd rather have the first. For a long moment he only looked at me, gold eyes bright with something that was no longer simply fear, and when he finally reached for my hand this time, his touch was warm rather than fevered, controlled, deliberate, a man choosing to hold something instead of merely failing to let it go. Minister Bo, he said quietly, will not stop with one fire, not now that he's seen how close he came. Then we stop him first, I said, together this time, not you alone in a cold room, and not me pretending I don't already know how to fight for something I want to keep. We had 4 days before Minister Bo would move again. This much Zhou Rui's informants confirmed, though not the shape the movement would take. Heng wanted me confined to my apartments under guard until the threat had passed. I wanted, for the first time in my life, to be more than a fragile thing kept safe in a locked room while other people decided my fate around me. You forget, I told him, the morning we finally sat together with the Dowager and Zhou Rui to plan rather than merely react, that I have spent 22 years being underestimated by people who assumed a weak body meant a weak mind. Bo has made that same assumption about me. Let him keep making it a little longer. The plan we built was simple in its bones, though it required more courage from me than any physical feat ever had. Bo believed me an easy target precisely because I was thought too sickly to notice danger, let alone plan against it. So I would give him exactly the target he expected, a consort alone, unguarded, visibly weakening, and let that appearance draw him into the open where Zhou Rui's men could finally catch him with evidence undeniable enough to survive the court's endless appetite for doubt. If anything goes wrong, Heng said, gripping my hand so tightly I felt it in my bones, I will not be far. I promise you that. I know, I said, and found strangely, that I believed him completely. The night itself unfolded with a cruelty of timing I should have expected and somehow hadn't. I sat alone in my apartments as arranged, lamp burning low, medicine cup at my elbow, untouched though I let it appear otherwise, and waited with my heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with illness this time. The servant who came for the cup was not one I recognized. She moved with the careful, over-rehearsed grace of someone performing a role rather than living one, and when she reached to exchange my untouched cup for a fresh one, I let my hand close over her wrist. You needn't trouble yourself, I said, keeping my voice light, the way I'd practiced. I find I'm not thirsty tonight. Something flickered in her expression. Recognition, perhaps, that the trap she'd been sent to spring was closing around her instead. She bolted for the door and found it already occupied, Zhou Rui filling the frame with 2 guards behind him, and beyond them, in the corridor, the unmistakable, furious voice of Minister Bo demanding to know why his men had been intercepted before they'd so much as reached the gate. He had come himself. Confident, I understood later, that a dying consort's death would draw so little scrutiny that his presence wouldn't matter, that no one would think to question a monster's household for a tragedy everyone already expected. He had not accounted for Heng. I felt the temperature shift before I heard him, The particular charged warmth that had come to mean, in the shorthand our marriage had built in a matter of weeks, that my husband's control was straining against something enormous. But this time, when he strode into the room, the heat radiating off him did not frighten me. It steadied visibly, the moment his eyes found mine and confirmed I was unharmed. "Minister Bo," he said, and his voice was colder than any fire had a right to sound. "You will explain to me, in detail, why you have spent the last month attempting to murder my husband and disguise it as the workings of my own curse." Bo's composure cracked for the first time since I'd known him. "Your Majesty, I have no knowledge of." "The servant in his apartments confessed to Zhou Rui not 10 minutes ago," Heng said. "The accelerant used in the physician's wing fire matches oil purchased under your steward's name, and the shipment intended for the medicine stores was traced, this very afternoon, to a merchant who answers only to you." He took one measured step forward, and I watched Bo actually flinch from the heat radiating off him. Though Heng's control, I could see, had never been steadier. "You built a rumor around me for years, Minister. A monster convenient enough to bury your crimes beneath. I would advise you, for what remains of your life, never to mistake my restraint for the absence of teeth." It was the Dowager, arriving with a contingent of her own household guard and a face like carved stone, who delivered the final blow, a ledger, produced from Bo's own study under warrant, detailing 3 years of correspondence with a rival faction eager to see the Dragon Throne destabilized by scandal. My death merely the latest and clumsiest instrument in a longer campaign. Bo was taken before dawn. I did not watch him go. I found, when it was finally over, that I wanted nothing more than to sit very still beside my husband and simply breathe, the way I had learned to do after every crisis my body had ever survived. Except that this time, for the first time in my life, someone sat beside me through it who was not merely tolerating my fragility, but had built his entire strategy around protecting it. "You were magnificent," Heng said quietly, once the room had finally emptied. His hand finding mine with a gentleness that made my chest ache in an entirely different way than illness ever had. "And I have never in my life been more afraid, watching you sit there and let yourself be bait." "I trusted you," I said. "That's different from being unafraid. I've simply decided, finally, that trusting you is worth the fear." He drew me carefully against him, warmth without danger now, controlled and certain in a way I understood had taken him a lifetime and one dying stranger to learn. "Then let me tell you," he murmured against my hair, "what I could not say the night we married, when you asked me to correct your father's arithmetic. I went very still, waiting. I did not choose you because you were unlikely to survive the year," he said. "I chose you because your letters to the border garrison, 3 years ago, arguing for grain reform on behalf of soldiers your father was actively defrauding, were the only honest words to reach my desk in a decade of court flattery. I have known your name longer than you have known mine, Lian. I simply never expected the man who wrote them to be the one they sent me to marry. I had not known, until that moment, that I had ever written anything the Dragon Emperor read. I remembered the letters vaguely, feverish, furious things I'd composed in secret during one of my worst winters, smuggled to the border garrison through a sympathetic steward because I could not bear to lie in my sickbed doing nothing while my father's greed cost soldiers their rations. I had never expected an answer. I had certainly never expected that the answer 3 years later would be a wedding. "You kept them," I said when I finally found my voice again. "My letters." "I kept them," Heng admitted, and told myself for 3 years it meant nothing beyond curiosity about an anonymous correspondent with more honesty than sense. It was easier to believe that than to admit I had been waiting, without quite knowing it, to meet the person who wrote them. His hand tightened around mine. "When your father's treason crossed my desk and I saw House Wei's name, and beneath it your name, I told myself I was choosing the safest possible consort. I have spent a great many years lying to myself in exactly that fashion. Lian. It is, apparently, a family talent." I laughed. Actually laughed. The first easy sound I'd made in weeks, and felt no answering stutter of protest from my heart. Only warmth, only him. Minister Bo's trial was swift and, by the standards of a court that thrived on drawn-out spectacle, remarkably undramatic. The evidence too complete, the confession of his co-conspirators too thorough. for even his allied faction to salvage a defense. He was stripped of rank and exiled to the northern territories he had once tried to starve for profit, a sentence the dowager privately called far more mercy than the man deserves, though I suspected some part of Heng had wanted worse and chosen restraint anyway, the same restraint he had spent a lifetime mistaking for the only safe way to love anyone. The rumor of the monstrous dragon emperor did not vanish overnight. Some stories, once planted, outlive the men who plant them, but it began, slowly, to lose its teeth. Zhou Rui, who had buried 3 of Heng's husbands and braced silently to bury a 4th, started speaking to me at court functions without the wary distance he'd first offered, and once, memorably, without prompting, told a visiting dignitary that I was the first consort with the sense to argue with His Majesty instead of simply fearing him, which I chose to take as the highest compliment the general was capable of giving. Winter deepened. My health did not improve. I want to be honest in the telling of this, and say plainly that no fairy tale love cured a heart built wrong from birth. I still tired after short walks. I still woke some mornings with my chest tight and my breath shallow, still counted stairs before I climbed them, still kept a ledger of what my body could and could not be trusted to do. That did not change. What changed was that I no longer counted those mornings alone. Heng learned, in the months that followed, to sit with his own grief instead of locking it behind cold rooms and colder distance. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, but visibly, deliberately, the way a man learns any difficult new language. There were nights the heat still rose in him, when news from the border was bad or old memories surfaced too sharp to manage alone. And on those nights he no longer sent me away. He came to find me instead, sat close enough that I could feel the warmth without fear, and let me be the one steady thing in a storm he no longer had to weather by himself. I learned, in turn, what it meant to be needed rather than merely tolerated, to matter to someone not despite my fragility but alongside it, fully seen. On the first morning of true spring, when the last of the winter palace's frost finally gave way to green things pushing up stubborn through the garden beds, Heng found me on the walled terrace where we had first taken tea as strangers feeling each other out across careful distance, months and a lifetime ago. "I have a confession," he said, settling beside me with a cup of tea he'd made too strong, exactly the way I liked it. "I did not expect you to survive the winter, Lian. Not truly. I built my heart a wall thick enough to withstand losing you, the way I had built one before, 3 times over. And now, he said, and there was no careful distance in his voice at all, only something warm and certain and entirely undisguised. I find I have stopped building walls against you altogether. I would rather risk everything on however much time we're given than spend a single day of it holding you at a careful distance to protect myself from the loss." I set down my cup, my traitor heart doing its familiar stumbling rhythm, for once entirely for the right reason, and took his hand instead, lacing our fingers together in the pale morning light. "Then don't," I said simply. "Whatever time we have, I'd rather spend it with the walls down, same as you." He kissed me then, gently, carefully, the way he did everything that mattered, and for the first time in 22 years of counting breaths and cataloging failures, I found I was not thinking about how much time I had left at all. I was only thinking about how glad I was to have spent what I had, so far, exactly here.
Thank you for watching. Come back soon for more.